Y Media Group, the fastest growing media group in North America.
Hello and welcome back to Y Media Newsroom. I'm Ramona Singh, and we woke up today to the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom. Essentially, this has been predicted for quite some time. He's had a very turbulent 23 months being in office and lots of calls for him to step down. And many times he says, no, he will not resign. If you recall, it first started with his pick in his cabinet, which was, someone who's very highly connected to Jeffrey Epstein. And then there was a lot of backlash in terms of what his cabinet pick was. And then one thing after another, he had his MPs essentially resigning. Many called for him to step down, and he tried to hold it together. Even at the G7, if you noticed, he was a little bit in the background, and a lot of people suspected, is this his last international forum where he's in front of, the world stage? And yes, it was. G7 was just last week, and, over the weekend, he announced that, there's high speculations that he is finally going to resign. There you have it. That is the United Kingdom's 6th Prime Minister in 7 years. So very turbulent times in the United Kingdom in terms of the high turnover when it comes to their Prime Ministers. Essentially a revolt from his own MPs as his poll numbers was dropping. They lost an election in the local elections, and there was a lot of speculation that this prime minister would not be able to take them into another general election, and there was growing concerns of his favorability with the British public, but also with his MPs. And so there was a lot of concern, and even though he said he would not resign over and over again, it came to a time where he finally saw, the music on the wall. He says that he'll remain the caretaker prime minister until a new Labour leader is chosen. Now, there's a lot of speculation that the former Greater Manchester mayor and the newly elected MP, Andy Burnham, is going to be the emerging leading successor for the Labour Party. And this resignation, has followed months of a lot of pressure on Prime Minister Keir Starmer. There you can see all the pictures of the previous prime ministers that, came before Keir Starmer at the bottom of the page from, Boris Johnson and on forth. Now, there was, poor local election results. There was declining approval ratings, as well as concern that he's just not going to be the leader that's going to take the Labour Party into the next general election. So this is a time where he's saying that he's going to facilitate an orderly transfer of power. And this came after the 2024 landslide majority that ended the 14 years of conservative rule, right? And so this was something that Keir Starmer brought in, but in a very short period of time, since 2024, we're looking at just less than 2 years. He's having to resign in front of 10 Downing Street, where you had more than 100 Labour MPs reportedly calling for him to resign and set a departure timeline to be able to move on. So, the leadership nominations are now expected to begin on July, just next month, and a successor would probably be chosen by September or before September. We'll know the rules when it's announced by the Labour Party. But Andy Burnham is widely viewed as the frontrunner to replace Starmer. And so several senior ministers had reportedly lost confidence in Starmer's leadership before this announcement, which pushed him to make this announcement. Now, Labour Party reportedly lost more than 1,000 local council seats in recent elections as well, fueling, this massive upset with his leadership. And consistent polling showed that Starmer's approval ratings had fallen to some of the worst levels recorded for modern, British prime minister. So this date was expected. And to this announcement, you had Reform UK leader Nigel Farage essentially asking for an immediate general election following Prime Minister Keir Starmer's resignation. You had Nigel Farage arguing that Britain should not have another unelected prime minister that's just chosen by whether the members of the Labour Party or by the Labour MPs. And to that, he made an argument. Take a look at his announcement, followed by the Prime Minister's resignation. There you had the leader, Nigel Farage of the Reform Party, who's actually doing quite well in the polls and have won some of the local elections as well. This is after the British people have shown that they're not satisfied with the Labour Party, which is left of centre, as well as the Conservative Party, which is right of centre. So the Reform Party is much farther right. And there's also been some election wins for the Green Party, which is far left of the Labour Party. So there you have this growing, dissatisfaction by the people of the United Kingdom that perhaps, it shouldn't just be between the Labour Party or the Conservative Party. So there's been major gains in local elections with the significant losses by Labour due to the, growing dissatisfaction for the two-party system between Labours and Conservatives. So now the UK Reform Party is seeing this as a very increased opportunity to be able to win some seats, and this is why you have the leader essentially, asking for a general election and not to be held out on just what the Labour Party decides to do or the Labour MPs in terms of the caucus decides to do. This is very significant because Britain is now preparing for its 7th Prime Minister in just 10 years, right? So this is a time where it's quite scary for the people and for what it means for business investments, for predictability in the United Kingdom. And, with Nigel Farage essentially demanding a political, this unrest, that saying that, go to a general election, let the people pick and stop doing what you're doing, which we saw happen with the Conservative Party. If you recall, Boris Johnson steps down, and then you had, Liz Truss, who became the Prime Minister because the Conservative Party held a nomination with the Conservative members, and they chose her. And then shortly after, she stepped down, and then Rishi Sunak that came up. But all that happened outside of the general election. And then you had, a general election held, and Keir Starmer just won. And then he's just had a massive political unrest in such a short period of time. Now, going to the story that everyone's been watching for quite some time for the last 3 months since the war began on February 28th, where you had Israel and the United States essentially attack Iran, and then therefore the war erupted. Then Hezbollah attacked Israel, and then the war started between Israel and Hezbollah that led into Lebanon. And we've been watching that, and even though the ceasefire began on April 8th, well, we saw, a lot of escalation still take place, even though after a while there was a stalemate. Now, since the MOU was signed last week by President Trump, and to start the fresh negotiations of the 60-day review, well, with Iran, well, that was a little bit slowed down. The MOU was signed on June 17th. It was scheduled to be signed on June 19th, but then it was moved up, and it was the president that signed when he was in France after the G7. So now we're at a time where we're watching what unfolded, and on the weekend, a lot unfolded. Essentially, there you have Vice President JD Vance meeting with the Pakistan leader to be able to essentially negotiate the terms with Iran, with Pakistan being the mediator. Here you have President Trump essentially saying that he got on a phone with the Iranian negotiators, saying that they're not going to make their way back home because they decide to close the Strait of Hormuz, because the escalations continued with Israel in Lebanon, in southern Lebanon, with Hezbollah forces. And so there you had, as you saw, all the different counterparts coming in. That's Pakistan, as well as the United States and Iran, showing up in Switzerland to have, this discussion to start this 60-day period of coming up with a final agreement. That is the Iranian delegation that is there with Araghchi, that's the foreign affairs minister of Iran. Essentially, there you have them greeting each other. But when President Trump made threats, he made threats with Israel as well as Iran, and, telling the Iranian negotiators they're not going to make their way back home. There you had then the Iranian delegation step out of the room. There you have a Qatari leader who's also part of the mediation. And there's been speculation that the Qatari leader snubbed Vice President JD Vance. And this is the vice president who's essentially been against a war with Iran. If you recall, this is what they campaigned on with President Trump. And there's been reports that from the Situation Room, it was the vice president that said he was against the war. He did not think it was a good idea to, start the war this year after the 12-day war last year. And then he said that, he will support the president, which the way he decides to go. And then the war did start on February 28th. So now you have Vice President JD Vance, who, was there during the first round of talks, if you recall, of that first time there was a ceasefire after April 8th. And, they couldn't come to an agreement. Now he's at the helm of these talks after President Trump signed the MOU. So now the most significant development is Iran's reported agreement to allow inspectors from the International Atomic Energy Agency back inside Iran. And so this is a very big deal because inspections could resume within days and represent the first major step towards essentially ensuring Iran does not develop nuclear weapons. This is a key thing for this MOU. And Iran has been more, cautiously, when on all these things when it comes to the detailed aspects of the nuclear negotiations. That is part of this review in the 60 days. Now, this was not in the MOU in terms of, what's going to happen with the enriched uranium that's still inside of Iran. And so what Iran has done in the meantime is still use the Strait of Hormuz as a major point, given that Israeli Prime Minister is saying he's not going to withdraw his IDF troops out of Lebanon. So to that, you had some, that escalation take place where Iran saying, okay, well, we'll just choke off parts of the Strait of Hormuz. We'll still, since the U.S. naval blockade has been lifted on Iranian ports, we'll still, do what we need to do from our side in terms of making sure our vessels leave our ports, but we'll block it for the rest, for the other GCC countries, which is obviously a situation that you had the president, make threats. And so there you have Vice President JD Vance really trying to find the balancing ground of making sure that the conversations and negotiations continue with Iran. And to that, you saw the Iranian delegations leave the room and then come back in after, some of that was resolved. But they did not take a joint picture together, which was something that was supposed to be scheduled for the world audience to see that, hey, there is developments happening between, the two countries. And but overall, there's been positive reactions to this. In these 60 days, Iran will have, their assets unfrozen, and parts of it would be given back to Iran. And this is a critical piece. And part of that MOU that the president signed was that, Lebanon was supposed to be part of the ceasefire. And so, as the U.S. and Iran agreed that Lebanon would be part of this, de-escalation efforts. This is something that we're seeing not take place with Israel and them deciding to withdraw their soldiers, saying that Israel is independent and sovereign country and that this agreement does not apply to them. But the MOU does say that it, applies to their regional partners as well as their allies. And if the United States signed, therefore, it's one of its greatest allies, as it always says, is Israel. So it's going to be very important to see what happens there. Part of what we're seeing take place is that Vice President JD Vance is saying that maybe Lebanon should have, their agreement ceasefire with Israel, but also after President Trump said that perhaps it's going to be Syria that's going to be able to handle Hezbollah and not so much Israel, because, there was a lot of criticism. This was at the G7, the closing press conference where the president of the United States, openly saying that Israel takes it too far. And obviously I'm paraphrasing by saying, there's one missile and then Israel will take down a building, pretty much saying that, and then it was recorded from his interviews with Axios that, the Prime Minister of Israel just doesn't have much sense when it comes to how he's proceeding in Lebanon. And so to that, you had President Trump say at the closing press conference at the G7 that, it should be Syria that should be able to deal with Hezbollah. And so to that, you have this entire situation where you have Vice President JD Vance essentially saying that, it should be the Lebanese army as a sovereign nation that protects its borders. But then you have the influence of Hezbollah in the Lebanese parliament. So that would be of a bit of a contradiction, and that could be the contentious issue that could potentially slow down these talks about what it means for the Lebanese army, what it means for Hezbollah in Lebanon, and Syria. Even though the Syrian leader said that he's going to talk to the Lebanese leader and decide what to do, but in terms of taking on the task by the president to be able to deal with Hezbollah is a whole nother aspect to it. So it is very complicated, because it's not just between the United States and Iran, which it was, if you recall, prior to February 28th. When the negotiations were taking place, it was just between the two countries. And now you have the aspect of Israel, and you have the aspect of Lebanon, and then you have the Lebanese parliament, and then you have the Hezbollah, and then now Syria has been pulled in, as per the president of the United States. So this is a developing thing, but the conversation's still taking place. The 60-day review, we're going to see what it means. But one thing that was of note is that the Iranian delegation had PhD people that knew about nuclear activity, nuclear programs, and the United States did not have those key negotiators that understand, when it comes to, enriched uranium and a nuclear program. And they just had JD Vance. But, it looks like JD Vance, is able to keep calm during this time. And even though there's the escalation by the president, having JD Vance there, who's been against this war, I think that creates possibly a level of trust by all the different counterparts, whether it's the mediators such as Qatar and Pakistan. But that's key. And what's interesting is you don't have Secretary of State Marco Rubio there as a part of these key negotiations. And we know that Marco Rubio, Secretary of State, was pro-war with Iran. And you have, JD Vance, Vice President, who was against the war. So that's a massive shift there. And we know that when it comes to the next general election, we know that obviously President Trump has, he's in his second term, and therefore he's not able to seek a re-election as the Republican candidate. So given that, in 2028, when we have a general election in the United States, well, the whole battle is between Secretary of State Marco Rubio and Vice President JD Vance for who is going to be the Republican nominee for president. So we're seeing this entire thing shift. And if this deal is done, and depending on how well it is for the American people, then this is something that Vice President JD Vance can actually campaign on. So this is, interesting to see how this is going to unfold, of course, during this time where we're watching this take place. And on a daily basis, of course, we're going to cover the latest development of what it means of this negotiation that's taking place at a time where we need more diplomacy between the two countries, the United States as well as Iran. We're going to take a quick break, and we'll be right back.